My lords, members of Parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm going to say a few words at this stage. I may have something to say later on. Can I first of all say how pleased we are to welcome Secretary Schultz, Secretary Bill Perry and Senator Sam Nunn here to join us, not only for a viewing of this important film, which is an argument, an advocacy for a world free of nuclear weapons, but they have graciously agreed to spend some time afterwards with us. I know some of you have had the benefit of conversations with them before we convened the meeting properly, but they graciously agreed afterwards to answer some questions. Right, so I first of all want to welcome them, and I want personally, and on behalf of the parliamentarians who have come together in a grouping here in the United Kingdom to advocate multilateral nuclear disarmament at a very high level, improve non-proliferation and increase nuclear security. I want to thank them on their behalf for the enormous support that they have given us individually and collectively, and organisations that they have been involved with have given us in the development of that group and in the development of a European network beyond that group, which has grown out of our group here in the United Kingdom. And that leads me on to my second thanks, which is to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a Washington-based organisation of enormous distinction, led by Sam Nunn and Ted Turner, and has the most incredible board of people who have given us extraordinary support. When I see the President, Joan Rothling, at the back of the room, and Isabel Williams, who I have worked with now very closely and have grown to respect enormously for the work that they do, Steve Andresen too. But the support that they have given us has been extraordinary. And I thank also my colleague Margaret Beckett, who as Foreign Secretary went and wooed the United States of America with the speech that she made in Carnegie, committing our government to this agenda, and came back with the idea that formed the top level group and has been responsible for the development of the European Leadership Network. Finally, I also want to thank the Scots Mafia of Ben Campbell and Malcolm Rifkin, who co-chair almost all of these initiatives or co-convene with me. The fact that we are all Scots, and the fact that we're all members of the Faculty of Advocates, and the fact that we're all friends has got nothing to do with it. We're driven by a desire to see a much safer world and to capture this moment in time to see if we can make from the United Kingdom a serious and significant contribution to an improved world. And I see Tom King and Geoffrey Howe and Douglas Hurd and people who would, if we were looked at from outside, form with us an improbable group of people, James Arbuthnot. I mean, there are others. We represent, I think, those who have had responsibility for foreign and defence policy in relation to these armaments over the last 20 years now. I have missed out, of course, Shirley, up until now. But that's because I'm going to invite Shirley to say a few words. And I've tried to woo Shirley back to where she belongs for some time. She's spurned my advances. But she will come and join me, I think, out here and say a few words before we go into the film. Shirley, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, you already probably realise that you can't keep a good Scotsman down. We did try for centuries, we totally failed, and in the end we had to devolve power to Scotland and just hope that they will use it reasonably, responsibly. Now, I want to just add a few words to what Des has said, because we're extremely pleased that you've come to this evening, and we think it's an important occasion. The first thing to say is that you will know, by looking at the picture of a more distinguished gang of four than the one I belong to, that these are four men who between them have effectively been the reason why the world has not slid towards nuclear warfare over the last 30 years. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to them, to George Shultz, to William Perry, to Sam Nunn, and to Henry Kissinger, who is not here but will be here in the morning. Why do I say that? Because almost immediately after the opportunity arose to try to create a new relationship with Russia, when Mr. Gorbachev, out of an extraordinary act of courage and imagination, decided to bring to an end the divisions of the Cold War. It was Sam Nunn, Richard Lugar, who cannot be here, and William Perry and George Shultz, who seized upon that opportunity to create a new relationship with Russia. And out of that new relationship came a security understanding which has meant that nuclear weapons and nuclear materials in Russia have been safeguarded as a result of an understanding that was reached outside the range of governments, but between Americans who are committed to the idea of a nuclear-free world and Russians, in the case of Mr. Gorbachev, who are willing to accept that kind of challenge. So we owe them a very great deal, because in some ways it's close to a miracle that there has been no nuclear war since 1945. Close to a miracle. And many people perhaps forget how very close we came to destroying that miracle, not least during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also on at least several other occasions. The other reason I'm very grateful to be here tonight is because you're going to see a film which in many ways parallels the film that was created on the environment called An Inconvenient Truth, which tries to bring home to us the long distance and permanent problems that the world has to address if it is to survive. And I think you will find, as we do, that it's a very impressive and powerful film. You're all here because the United Kingdom is one of the powers that has some influence on the outcome. And I share the tribute was paid by, about just now, by Des to Margaret Beckett and to her colleague Malcolm for having started that process going. And now what is wonderful about the top-level group in Britain is that we have a whole range of secretaries, of former Secretary of Defence, former Foreign Secretaries, many of whom, as Des has said, are here with us, who have been committed to trying to find a better answer to the problems that confront us. So I won't hold you up any longer. You have many people to talk to and many things to do. But it is for me a privilege to be here, and a great privilege that people like George Shultz have flown all the way from California without stopping in order to be present. That Sam Nunn and Bill Perry have come from Brussels, where they've been associated with discussions about NATO, and their wives accompanying them, trying to hold them together. And we're very grateful to all of you for what you've done. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you'll find it.
Shirley, I don't propose to make another speech, but I deliberately did not mention this gentleman because he deserves a special place in our acknowledgement of his presence, and that's Ben Goddard, who wrote and directed this film, who is with us this evening. And I think we should just give him a quick round of applause before we see his
I should almost mention Mr. Tobias Elwood, in front of the Member of Parliament, who will be actually presiding over the discussion, which will be brief, but I hope very pointed, because it's a very rare and great opportunity immediately after the film. So if you have questions you want to ask of four of the three greatest experts out of four in the world from the United States, that will be an opportunity, and Tobias over there will be actually moderating the discussion.
I want to introduce this film from the standpoint of a soldier who was taught to use nuclear weapons and as a diplomat who worked hard for their elimination. As a 21-year-old second lieutenant assigned to Germany, one of my first missions was to guard an atomic cannon, a huge machine that ran around Germany on a couple of trucks. A few years later, as a captain, I was taught how to actually employ this weapon and other similar weapons, I was taught how to determine what the blast effects of such weapons would be, how many people would be killed by the blast, how many buildings would be knocked down. I was also taught what the thermal effects would be, how things would be burned, how people would be burned. I was taught about the radiation effects, and I was taught to plot the fallout pattern that would come from the use of nuclear weapons as the dirt was thrown up into the sky and spread out across the landscape. And then I became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1989, and I had 28,000 nuclear weapons under my supervision. And every morning I looked to see where the Russian submarines were off the coast of Virginia and how far away those missiles were from Washington. And I kept track of where the Russian missiles were in Europe and in the Soviet Union. And the one thing I convinced myself of after all these years of exposure to the use of nuclear weapons is that they were useless. They could not be used. The real threat now is not from states that understand that you cannot use these weapons without inviting suicidal response, but terrorists who do not care about suicidal response, terrorists who are prepared to commit suicide themselves. And so it is important at this point in our international history that we all come together behind this initiative that you're going to hear about to make sure that we start a process that will lead to the reduction in the number of nuclear weapons that exist in the arsenals of the world now, that will deter other nations from moving forward on nuclear weapons programs, but above all, will capture and contain the elements that are out there, the devices that are out there, the technology that is out there, the uranium and plutonium sources that may be out there that a terrorist could get his hands on to try to develop a rudimentary or real nuclear weapon.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very powerful and moving film. It's now an opportunity to put your questions to the panel. I just might begin by saying that since we were planning this event, we've had the Arab Spring, the Japanese tsunami, and the death of bin Laden. Amazing events which have rippled right across the world. And just to put in context these issues of nuclear power and nuclear energy, just only yesterday, 2 statements were made to the United Kingdom Parliament. Firstly, confirming our intention for peaceful use of nuclear power and next generation of reactors. And secondly, probably more critically, the intention to replace our Trident submarine fleet of our nuclear deterrent. Just 160, stockpile of 160 warheads out of a total of 20,000 in the world. So events do move swiftly. Enough from me. Thank you very much once again to our panel. I think we'll just open it straight up to the audience, who I understand it's almost like a reunion. All the people here know each other so well. But do please, if you could just say your name, just so we can see where you're coming from. Tom King's already caught my eye.
Tom King, I was interested in, say, engage your senator and your congressman. How well are they doing? There are rather disturbing reports becoming a bit of a party political battle, you might say, over these issues. Whereas I'd like to think in this country, under Liz Brown's leadership as well, we've got a pretty good cross-party support, very wide indeed, for these initiatives. What's the state of Congress?
First of all, during the last presidential election campaign, both candidates expressly endorsed what we were doing. And then after the election, President Obama immediately moved, I think, rather powerfully in actions in this area. And Senator McCain made a very strong speech on the floor of the Senate endorsing this effort. So it was kept, in a sense, as we think of it, nonpartisan. Since that time, a lot has been accomplished. But from a standpoint of our Congress, a key thing was the so-called New START Treaty. And it was introduced, and Senator Lugar, the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, expressed his support for it. there was a hearing, and then it went to Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There was a hearing. Bill was one of the testifiers. The Republican testifier, so to speak, was Jim Schlesinger, who picked away at the treaty. And at the end, he was asked, well, under all the circumstances, would you vote for ratification? He said, of course it should be ratified. It then got voted out of committee, and some Republicans joined Dick Lugar to make that possible. And then it wound its way along. There was a lot of yakety-yak. In the end, it got ratified. So nothing happens without difficulty and compromise. But anyway, it happened. I think there are all sorts of problems to work with our Congress. But Sam Nunn used to tell me all the time when he was a senator and I was Secretary of State, if you want me in on the landing, include me in the takeoff. So I think as the administration works, or as we work in this country toward additional things, it's really important to start with people at the beginning and include them. And if there are going to be negotiations, have a process like the one that we had, where we had observer groups. At first, I might say I was a little uneasy as Secretary of State that this is the executive's job and what are these guys going to do? But they came, they met with the Soviets, they met with our people. I was a little afraid they might undercut us. That never happened at all, never. But then when we brought the treaty back to the Senate, they knew all about it. They had been in at the takeoff. And I think it makes a huge difference. So when it comes to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty right now, if you threw it at the Senate and took a vote, you'd lose. But that's not the way to do it, and I think the administration is seeing that you got to go about it one senator at a time and build your case. And that's true with all of these things.
One of the things that I think is important, George just mentioned, and that is the Arms Control Observer Group. We had the blessings of the leadership when we formed that. Ted Stevens and I were the first co-chairs of it. We went to Geneva, where we had discussions going on, and Vienna. We probably went over a period of each year, we probably went 2 or 3 times. And we'd have 10, 12, 14 senators, both parties. They aren't doing that now, and I think they really need to take another look at that. That makes an enormous difference because they understand what's happening and not just have a treaty presented to them without having a background. I think that's got to be done, as George said, on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I believe the Senate, one of its great prerogatives is the basic ratification of treaties. It basically puts the Senate in the constitutional role of helping frame and shape American foreign policy. But if treaty ratifications are as difficult as they've been in the past, I think inevitably presidents are going to move towards more executive agreements or even avoiding executive agreements and move towards just informal agreements, which is not good for anyone. We need to continue the process of ratification, but the Senate itself, for instance, the law of the sea, enormously important to our own country, and it's been sitting there for years. At some point, executive branch will get less and less favorable to moving in that fashion with treaties, and I think that'll undermine the rule of law around the globe. So I think the Senate has to take another whole look at the way they're going about ratification. That's not to say they got to sign up for everything. That's not their role, but they need to get the process better than it is now. And the George Shultz leadership when he was Secretary of State was remarkable in that sense. He basically, I don't know how many times, I saw George more as Secretary of State than I did all the others that I served with during that time. And it wasn't because I was his favorite, it's what he did. He reached out. And that lesson...
I always thought you were my friend.
Well, except on the golf course, yeah.
Tom, I'd give you a little different cut on that. That I don't believe this Congress, in the last couple of years, has voted 2/3 on anything and therefore was quite apprehensive about this treaty coming forward, and yet it passed with about 5 votes to spare. And I think
there would have been more if they were needed, I think.
There were 4 more votes that didn't vote for it because of other reasons, in my opinion.
But I think I would say that the attention and the publicity we've given this issue had a lot to do with that rather lopsided vote. That's the good news. The bad news is that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is, the President is not willing even to bring it for vote now because he does not think he will get to 2/3 on it. So the bad news is we still have a lot of hard work ahead of us to relate the story we're telling here to the importance of the step, and the next step being this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is a very important one.
And a lesson there, I wasn't there when it was voted down, I'd already left the Senate, but it was voted down without preparation that George has outlined and I've outlined, and it came up, and they made a terrible mistake, those who were in favor of it, by agreeing to unanimous consent to vote on a date certain without having any certainty of the votes, and then they couldn't get out when they realized they didn't have the votes. So they would have been much better to bring it down and go back and be patient about it. Now, what you've got to do is convince senators who voted no that there have been enough changed circumstances so they can tell their constituents that they were right when they voted no, but they would also be right when they voted yes.
You don't have to change your mind.
As members of Parliament, you're well aware of that challenge.
Yeah, we need to know that over here as well.
But,
yes, sir.
but the evidence has come in. It is
That's right.
a different picture.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Richard Gassman, currently at the University of Bath. A nuclear weapon-free world has to be something more than simply a world where all the nuclear weapons have gone. For a nuclear weapon-free world to be sustainable, it has to be a world that's more stable and more secure than it is today, or else it's impossible to sustain. So what else is it we have to do other than simply destroy the nuclear weapons to make that a sustainable objective?
Richard, you saw a list up there of things we put in our Wall Street Journal editorial in the first one, and of course that's not all inclusive, but those are the big sweeps. You're exactly right. In my view, the way I've expressed it, and a couple of my Russian friends have expressed it the same way, is that a world without nuclear weapons is not today's world simply subtracting nuclear weapons. You've got to change people's hearts and minds and apprehensions and fears and distrust in numerous regions around the world. We had one on the list, the 2 things that are the most difficult were toward the end of the list. One is bearing down on regional conflicts, because the whole globe has a stake in these regional conflicts. This is not simply a matter of sovereignty. There was a recent article in American Scientific Magazine that had done a huge amount of supercomputer work, taking the hypothetical of 100 weapons going off between India and Pakistan and looking at the result. And the result, according to this article and according to this scientific study, was a couple of 100 million people killed immediately with 100 weapons, but 1 billion people dying over the next 5 years because of starvation, because of the effect of blocking out the sun. So this is not simply a sovereign question. We're talking about whether we are going to have the existence, we're talking about the future of God's world. I mean, in the existence of mankind here. That's the stakes. And while we've greatly reduced the chances of an all-out war between the United States and Russia, we still are postured in a way where an accident or mistake could really set off something nobody intended. And that is, in this day and world, ridiculous. So we've got to set an example between the United States, Russia, and NATO. And a lot of that's being discussed right now with missile defense cooperation, which I think if we could get it done would be a game changer. I think it would change the whole psychology. Mm-hmm. But the world's got a stake in what happens in India and Pakistan. The world has a stake in what happens in the Middle East. And so we've got to deal with these regional conflicts. And I would add one other thing that was on that list that may be one of the most difficult will be, and that is verification and enforcement. We've got to be able to verify for the world to have confidence. We've got to be able to verify not just weapons, but nuclear materials. We've got to secure those materials, and we've got to know that we've secured them. That's enormously important. Great Britain and Norway have a verification study going on right now. They're doing a lot of intensive work. Very important. Our foundation has a lot of work going on verification, but also enforcement. When you have an Iran and North Korea, I call these avalanches coming down the mountain that we're trying to climb. When you have those countries like that, the world has to have the political will to have them comply. That's not easy, but we've yet to demonstrate we have that. So all of these things have to be on the list of steps that are essential.
Besides,
I think it's also true that the more unstable the world is, the more important it is not to have nuclear weapons around. Granting that instability will be a reason why some countries want them, it is also a reason to try to stop them.
one other point of view on that is even if all of the problems of the world are not solved, is to understand that nuclear weapons don't necessarily serve as a deterrent to the issues you're dealing with. From the American point of view, they were not sufficient to deter the Korean War. They were not sufficient to deter the Vietnam War. We faced those anyway, even though we had an overwhelming superiority in nuclear weapons. From Russia's point of view, all they had to do was observe that they did not prevent the Soviet Union from collapsing, absolutely collapsing. Nuclear weapons had nothing to do with that. So it's also important to understand the limitations of nuclear weapons. People tend to place too much importance, too much credence on them.
Sir, and then Lord Hurd. Yes.
Dr. Sanders, the kind of world you're describing now, in answer to the last question, is obviously needed, but obviously will only come about with leadership. And around about 1989-90, it seemed possible that the United States of America was getting itself into a position where it was the only superpower, it was the only country which could possibly lead the world into a situation of international effort, of laws, of rules, which even the most important country, the United States, were willing to accept. Now that seems to have slipped, and there's a great deal of discussion across the world about how you substitute, given that there's no single superpower, how you substitute different kinds of leadership, but producing it towards the same goal. How do you see that?
Well, first of all, from the United States standpoint, I think we have to do three things. Number one, we have to get our own house in order from an economic standpoint. We can't be spending more than we earn forever. I think something like that is underway, because by this time, across the political spectrum, nobody will get up and say, it's okay to spend endlessly, deficits don't matter. Nobody says that anymore. So maybe we're on our way. It's going to be hard, but anyway, that's important. Number two, we need to get better control over our energy situation. And there's a lot of R&D going on now. And I hope that we are going to see some game changers come about. That hasn't happened, but there's a lot, you listen to these guys and I listen to them, there's a lot of stuff out there that could lessen our dependence on oil, change the energy situation. I think nuclear power is under a lot of pressure right now. And a lot of people don't want to be dependent on nuclear power. Personally, I think we want to try to save that situation, but to do so, we have to examine very carefully the kind of situation created when you have something where a difficult event is very, very unusual and unlikely, but when it happens, it's catastrophic. So how do you manage that kind of risk? And we have to do a better job of thinking that through. And third, in the United States, we have to do a much better job than we're now doing on K through 12 education. We get those three things in place. Control in a fiscal sense, better energy picture, and get our education geared up, and we're there. I don't think the United States wants to be the dominant player, but certainly we want to be a country with influence that says we've figured out how to be helpful without being dominant, and be a genuine stakeholder in the world. And I might say, going back to my own experience, there's one country you look to work with as a genuinely constructive partner. It's Britain. Very much the case. So don't check out.
Do you want to add anything? Sam William, do you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Richie, Department of Peace Studies at the University of London. It's clear that key to the process of moving up towards the mountain is one of building strategic reassurance between the United States, Russia, and China. So I'd like your views on how you think, over the longer term, strategic reassurance can be built at a deep political level, particularly with China. How we can overcome what's been called the bureaucratization of homicide that still seems to persist 20 years after the Cold War. Thank you.
Maybe we should hold this one for Henry Kissinger. He just wrote his book on China, and he'll be here tomorrow morning. But I would say we need to keep China informed. We need to have a dialogue with them. We need to keep them informed of, even though U.S. and Russia have 90% of the nuclear weapons, we have a responsibility in that respect. We're unique in that respect. China is a nuclear power, and we need to get them involved in protecting nuclear materials around the globe. We, right now, our foundation, for instance, have got an international advisory board. We're creating a scorecard on nuclear materials and how well countries that went to the summit conference, even those who didn't go, are basically doing on protecting nuclear materials. We have a Chinese scientist on that international panel. Now that's an NGO effort, but we've got the Economist magazine, Economist research group doing the scorekeeping, and we have an international panel on that, so we'll have a yearly score about how we're doing on protecting nuclear materials starting in October. That's just one example of keeping the Chinese informed. The Chinese historically, I haven't been briefed on it lately, but historically have not had their weapons in a hair-trigger posture, and I'm hoping they do not. The United States and Russia need to move away from the posture we're in now, where we have thousands of weapons that could be shot in an hour, hour and a half. If we both moved away from that posture, and it would take some work and take some creativity, if we both moved away from that posture, nuclear weapons would become less relevant. You wouldn't have done away with them immediately, but you would have made a big difference in the psychology. We've got to have that kind of discussion. And if we can have it with Russia, we need to also have it with China. So China's got to play a big role in this, and we need to keep the Chinese informed. On missile defense, if we are able to get cooperation with Russia, I think it ought to be an open-ended type system. We couldn't involve China now, it'd be too complicated to do, but we ought to make it clear that they could be part of this system too, because the first thing we're trying to tackle is defenses against short-range intermediate missiles. And the INF Treaty, which George Shultz under President Reagan led, we in Russia abolished that class of missiles, so we're protecting against those. And for other countries who are willing to give up those missiles, they ought to be able to come into the missile defense picture. Now this has all got to take a lot of work. It's not going to be easy. But we are. I just spent 2 days in NATO, and they are working very hard on this question of missile defense with Russia. There'll be obstacles, it'll be tough, but it would be a game changer if we were able to create that psychology. And it could be some lessons learned with India and Pakistan there. You know, the U.S. and Russia went through, Soviet Union then, went through the Cold War. Our military people, led by people with the wisdom of Bill Perry, they did a great job. And the Soviet military people were careful, they were professional with their way they handled nuclear weapons. But we were also lucky. We were very lucky. We had a lot of close calls. Deterrence in some limited sense, as Bill said, worked in that sense. But if deterrence had failed, you know, God's universe was at stake. That is not a posture we ought to want gladly to pass down to our children and grandchildren. We've got to figure out how to dismount this tiger. It won't be easy. The Russians have got to do it too, and the Chinese have to be part of that.
I think it's I don't ever foresee the day when the United States and China would become allies. But I think it's very clear that it's in the best interest of both countries to remain friends and to cooperate. And I believe the leaders of both of our countries see it that way. I do have to observe that you should never underestimate the ability of a country to act against its own best interests. That has happened in history. But the odds are against it now, and I think very clearly the leaders of both of our countries are not inclined to do that, and we will find ways of working together, cooperatively and peacefully, but never approaching the point of an alliance.
Let me add, agreeing with what Sam and Bill have said, but pointing out that China 10 or 15 years from now is not going to look the same as it does now. China, for the last 25 years, has had a very rapid rate of increase in its labor force, and a decrease in the number of people the labor force has been supporting, the so-called demographic dividend. As their one-child policy, now some 30 years old, those people hit older ages. I think within maybe a year or two, that rapid rate of increase in the labor force is going to level off. This is the labor pool. And only a few years after that, like 4 or 5, so this is very short term, it'll start going down. The difference between this and this is gigantic. Now, I know there's a lot of underemployment in China, so it won't have as crisp an effect, but the effect will be there. Furthermore, their very rapid rise in productivity is caused by the movement of people from rural to urban areas. And that has not run its course, but they probably skimmed the cream off of that. You remember, your rate of increase in GDP is the sum of the rate of increase in your labor force plus the rate of increase in your productivity. So I think there's going to be a change. And it's also striking how sensitive the Chinese government is right now to what's going on in the Middle East. They're very leery about the slightest little dissent of any kind. And that's not a healthy situation to be in that posture. So they may see something to cause them to shift their gears. So I don't think this notion was like when Japan was rising. Everybody said, well, Japan's got the future, that's it. You wouldn't say that today. Part of the reason is demographic. And the demographic influences in China are there very visibly and right there for all to see.
One other comment about China and technology. China has embraced modern technology, including communication technology, including internet technology. At the same time, it has tried to control how the internet can get information to its people, which in my judgment is a long-term losing battle. They have been terrorized by what they saw in the Middle East revolution, by the role that the social networks and technology played in that. And they're right now operating on very uncertain and very dangerous ground because they want to have it both ways. They want to keep China leader in technology, all this internet technology. On the other hand, they want to keep the social networks from influencing their own thinking of their own young people. And they cannot square that circle, in my view. So this is a very tough problem. It's a big problem ahead of them. I don't know how it's going to come out, but it's going to be a big problem for the Chinese government.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You've been very generous with your time, and the hour is late. My name is Dan Pesh from the University of London. I wanted to ask you for comments on both verification and on confidence building. On the verification side, one of the happy things out of the whole Iraq episode was the success of UNRWA operation, and whether we should be looking rather more at the global application of the avert regime as a means of addressing the verification and inspection problem. And on the confidence side, thanks in large part to the efforts of some of you on the panel, in Europe at the end of the Cold War, we've made huge progress with open skies, confidence building and the CFE Treaty, all of which are languishing somewhat. And should we not perhaps be looking at the global application of these sorts of agreements in regional contexts to underpin our efforts on weapons of mass destruction? Thank you.
Could I ask, if we take the second question at the same time, and then people can, panel can choose which aspect they would like to answer. If we just pass the microphone across to the
verification question,
if that's okay.
Take the verification question.
John Simpson used to be in the University of Southampton until recently. We have at the moment the beginnings of a negotiation, an engagement between the P5 on nuclear disarmament through the September 2009 meeting in London and the forthcoming meeting in Paris. At the same time, we have real problems in any sort of engagement with those states which are outside the NPT, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. I wonder if you can offer us some thoughts on how we come to grips, on how we, A, may move forward with the P5 discussions, and B, come to grips with the problem that we just don't seem to be able to engage the states outside the NPT in discussions on disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me comment on the verification issue. There have been remarkable advances in technology in the last decade or two, which bear very heavily, very importantly, on the verification issue. One positive aspect of that is that if we are successful in getting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty ratified, I think the technical means of verification will be quite up to the task of verifying that treaty, where that was very much in question during the late 90s when it was rejected and passed. And that's the good news. The bad news is that the next treaty we're looking at with Russia is going to involve verifying not just missiles, but warheads themselves. This is a fundamentally much more difficult verification task. And there's no technical means I know of that will be in itself capable of doing that verification. So the verification is going to require a high degree of intrusiveness, a high degree of cooperation. And the very positive sign here is that the New START treaty has embedded in it cooperation of an intrusive verification. So we're taking a very important step in that direction. I just will say that the step we're taking in New START is a very small step compared to the step we would have to take in cooperation to be able to verify a treaty that involved verifying warheads themselves.
On the second question, I'll make a brief answer. I don't have a complete answer to it because it's a challenge that doesn't have a complete answer in my view. But the question of those countries that did not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, North Korea is a special case. Its economy, all the things George said we had to do, fiscal, education, and energy. Just think about what they've got to do to have a viable country. They don't have a viable country right now. They can't sustain themselves over the long haul with the kind of closed system they have now. The question is how you get them to discuss seriously their nuclear components, and that's a really hard road. I don't have a complete answer except we've got to be united with Japan, South Korea, and we've got to do everything we can to get the Chinese as involved as possible. The great difficulty is they're such a unstable country with their poverty and their starvation and their huge economic problems that both our friends in South Korea as well as our friends in China are worried about their collapse. So it's limit to how much pressure neighbors are willing to put on the North Korean economic system when they are as concerned about collapse as they are about nuclear weapons. So that's the framework. We've got to be firm and patient on that one. In terms of India and Pakistan and also Israel and the Middle East, This goes back to what I was talking about the real stake the world has in bearing down on these regional problems that could cause not just conflict, but could go nuclear. And we have a real stake in working on that. It's hard right now because we've got so much else going on with Pakistan. We've got a lot of strains there, but I said the other day, and I still believe with Pakistan, we've got to be direct, we've got to be firm, we've got to do things in a quiet way. Both countries, with the frustrations we have now, realizing the stakes we have and realizing the stakes they have, I think we need to take a deep breath and count to 10 because we've got a stake in working with them and they have a stake in working with us. India, we have a much better relationship with now. The nuclear deal we made with India really warmed that relationship, but to some extent it was at the expense of relationship with Pakistan, and we don't have a good approach in that respect at this time.
Your question, to a certain extent, says, how do you get the world to work better? And that's a tough thing. It has been the case, I think, as we look at the Cold War experience, that it seemed like a pretty impossible thing, but we kept at it together, and eventually it got better. And there were many periods when it was thought the Soviets would never change, and that was true in many people's eyes almost right to the end. Some of us thought otherwise. I think the British government thought otherwise. President Reagan and I thought otherwise, but not everybody in our government agreed, but we kept at it. So I think being persistent, having the right kind of a goal will pay off. Let me give you a somewhat of an example from the construction business. I used to be in that business. If you say to me as a construction guy, build me a bridge across the Potomac River, well, I do my soils test, sink my piers, and a little while later, I've got you a bridge there, you can drive the truck over it, problem solved, done with that. If you say to me, build the bridge in such a way that there are no lost time accidents while the bridge is being built, and I put up guardrails and so on, and I think I've solved the problem, done with that, I've lost. It's not that kind of a problem. But if I work at it creatively, professionally, ruthlessly, I just might get that bridge built without a lost time accident. And I think in many ways the business of how you get the world to work better is like that. It's not a soluble problem in the sense that you're going to finally put in place A, B, C, and D, done with that, walk away. It's something that we have to work at. We have to have ideas, we have to have strength, and we have to have strength of purpose. We have to have allies who work along together. We have to engage the people who are difficult in some way or another. Sometimes the best way to engage them is not to talk to them, and they feel it. People say we didn't engage with Iran in the Reagan administration. Actually, we did quietly, but when they were messing around with Kuwaiti shipping, we reflagged the ships to our flag. And when the president of Iran was in the United Nations making a speech saying the last thing Iran would do would put a mine in the Persian Gulf, our Navy was taking a picture of them doing it. And then we boarded the ship and took some mines off for evidence, took the sailors off, sank the ship, took the sailors to Dubai and said to Iran, come and get your sailors and cut it out. So it was very clear communications. Sometimes you have to do that. But I think the key is to have some goals of what makes sense and to keep working at them. And I think getting rid of nuclear weapons makes sense for everybody because the consequences of their use are so catastrophic. And if it's possible to make progress on that goal, a lot of other things will fall into place along with it. And I think the chances are, in some ways, that a real galvanizing of people to get behind this effort could wind up doing a lot of other kinds of things, consequentially making the world better. So
thank you very much.
My message is never give up. Keep working on it.
Before I hand back to Des Brown to say a vote of thanks, could I just take us back very quickly to Pakistan, which has that rather volatile combination of active terrorism, but also a nuclear arsenal. The death of bin Laden has, I think, tested the relationship between Pakistan and the United States. The United States and other countries are, of course, pointing fingers, saying, sort your act out. Pakistan is then saying, actually, I need help. How can that relationship be repaired, and how do we move forward to make sure Pakistan is able to look after its nuclear weapons and solve its terrorism issues?
Let me start off by observing that, in my judgment, Pakistan is the most dangerous nation in the world. We talk about the danger of nuclear terrorism. If it is to happen, the probability that bomb comes from Pakistan is higher than any other country in the world. If there's going to be a regional nuclear war, that's the likely place it's going to be. So Pakistan, especially from a nuclear point of view, is the most dangerous country in the world. That's the easy part of the statement. The hard part is what the hell to do about it. And I don't have a good answer to that question. I think we have to keep working at it day after day. I don't have a solution to the problem, but we cannot lose engagement with Pakistan. They are too important, not just to the region, but to the whole world because of the nuclear weapons they have. But that engagement cannot be based on a fallacy. It cannot be based on a lie. We have to recognize the nuclear program. We have to recognize the importance of the Taliban and the other insurgent groups, not just its threats to the Pakistani government, but their infiltration of the Pakistani government. So these are very difficult and serious problems, and we have to deal with them seriously and realistically.
Boss, let me shift to one subject before we close, and that is every now and then you need some hope. There are a number of countries that have given up nuclear weapons, and the problem is we forget them. Those that have them get a lot of attention, and those that give them up, we forget them. Kazakhstan got rid of nuclear weapons. Ukraine got rid of nuclear weapons. Belarus got rid of nuclear weapons. South Africa got rid of nuclear weapons, all voluntarily. Syria and Libya got rid of their nuclear programs somewhat inadvertently, but nevertheless. Also Iraq. And also Iraq. So you count the number of countries that have gotten rid of them in the last 20, 25 years, it exceeds the number that have added nuclear arsenals. To me, that's encouraging. Let me give you one other example. Right now in the United States, 20% of our electric power comes from nuclear power, 20%. 50% of the fuel that is burned in those nuclear plants, producing 20% of the power, 50% of it comes from highly enriched uranium that during the Cold War was in warheads pointed at America and our allies. So by definition, 10% of America's electricity, 1 out of every 10 light bulbs, comes from highly enriched uranium that during the Cold War was pointed at us. This goes back to the alt and the is that George used, which I think is so powerful. This really happened, and it is a reality. People would have never dreamed, they would have said it was impossible back during the 1950s, the 1960s, the early 1970s, but it happened. So there is hope. We are making progress, and there are still avalanches coming down the mountain, but we are beginning to find pathways up the mountain. We're beginning to, because of dialogue around the world, to find something like base camp. Before I close, I want to thank Shirley Williams, who is an extremely valuable member of our board on the foundation, and I want to thank Des Brown, who has done a remarkable job in terms of the leadership group here and throughout Europe. Tobias, thank you for your participation tonight and your leadership. And one other person I want to thank, and I should thank a lot more, but Margaret Beckett. Margaret, you made a speech that was so powerful at Carnegie shortly after we had come out with our Wall Street Journal editorial, waiting for the avalanches to come down, but you basically endorsed the program on behalf of your government, enormously important. And your message was contagious. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. I'm conscious this room is getting warmer and we've run out of time in any event, but if you just bear with me for a couple of minutes, there are a few people I have to be thanked, because as people always say in these circumstances, these events don't happen by themselves. There is organisation, and quite a lot of organisation at that, and we have particularly, and I'm going to name these people because they've worked extremely hard, and I know they have, to organise this event and make it the success it has been. From the NTI, our colleagues Karen McDougall, Cathy Gwynn, Naomi Dale, and from the TLG ELN, my colleagues there, Shaka Shetty, Stella Petrova and Elise Connor. And I want to give them a round of applause, because people who do this work very I'm going to finish off this vote of thanks very quickly, because Sam's already thanked a significant number of people, and I don't think they need to be thanked again. But you know, I want to thank 3 of the 4 people who have shown the most extraordinary leadership, particularly from their own backgrounds in this particular field. And I have to say, you know, in the last 15 or 20 minutes in these questions, we've seen the complexity and the difficulty of the challenges that we face because of the world that we people have created. You know, these complex interrelations between all of these challenges we face across the world, and security and our personal safety, are our creations. We made them and we can unpick them. And I say, because of the leadership of these 4 men, and because of the people who have fallen in behind them, some of whom have been mentioned tonight and some of whom have not been mentioned, but significant financial support behind the initiatives that they drive forward. There are now literally hundreds of people in political leadership roles across the world who have signed up to this. The film identified just some, but there are hundreds. You know, only the other day, out of this initiative, there was born a leadership network in Asia Pacific region led by Gareth Evans, and I, you know, saw the announcement of the beginning of that process. This is a movement that is sweeping the world, and all of these challenges will take a long time to answer, but we will answer them, I am absolutely certain. I think tonight we've also seen why this leadership is so important, because even in the small time that you've been with us, gentlemen, we've seen the depth of experience, the knowledge and the commitment, and the talent that you bring to this, and the drive that you bring to it. And when you should actually probably be on the golf course enjoying retirement, you know, after an enormous contribution to public life and to our safety over a lifetime. Yeah, we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude, and we have been privileged, I think, to have you with us. The last round of applause actually is for the audience, because you turned up and made this event successful and engaged with it. So thank you very much for coming. Just all join together and applaud each other.
Well done. I'm glad to see the younger generation.
Well, I was going to say, I'm happy to sort of help on and keep flying the flag. And I'm a junior person in the whole scheme of things. So it's overall by the 30 actors. And obviously you guys are on television, like these characters, but I'm also half American. In New York. Is that right? So, Sam, thank you very much. Well, I'm going in the
or maybe 20 or 30. It's amazing, unusual to have a group in way.
But some progress is being made.
I have been writing about nuclear weapons for over 50 years now. I try to apply traditional diplomatic principles to a world with nuclear weapons. And I found it almost, I would say, impossible to do. So the consequences have to be looked at 2 levels. One is technically what happens if, say, a 20-kiloton weapon hits downtown New York. And that's a very small weapon. Most of the hospitals, most of the medical facilities, most of the powers, most of the bridges, most of the communications would be gone. There's a second level, namely, what do people think happened that permitted such casualties to occur? And what will the demand of their government? And if they will probably say globally, if this can't be prevented, what's the use of any government?